Question number 4, Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Building and Housing. Does he stand by his statement that the evidence about overseas...
Order. There's just too much chatter going on. Mr Mark, if you wish to carry on a conversation, do it in the lobbies. Phil Twyford, could we have the question again, please?
Certainly may. My question is for the Minister for Building and Housing. Does he stand by his statement that the evidence about overseas buyers impacting the New Zealand housing market is diddly squat?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
This statement was made in response to the member's claim that 40% of Auckland house sales were to people with Chinese-sounding names and thus foreigners. We now have data on tax residency of the buyer and seller of every property. In the first 6 months of this year, we had 102,792 transactions, of which 2,907 buyers were tax resident offshore and 2,622 sellers were tax resident offshore. This net change of 285 out of 102,000 is impacting diddly squat on the housing market.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Does he consider the $100 million in tax lost due to tax breaks to offshore property speculators, tax that hard-working Kiwi families have to then make up for, to also be diddly squat? And if not, how much diddly of the tax system will it take before his government does something about the speculators who are ripping us off?
Insofar as this ministerial responsibility, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
The member's figures are incorrect, but also overlook two significant facts. That is, from the 1st of July, law passed by this government actually requires a withholding tax on all sales by non-resident taxpayers, and that actually, given that rents are relatively flat, I think most would accept the major gains have actually been in the value of the house rather than the rent. The second recent change is the new LVR limits require a high level of deposit by investors, and that will actually reduce the amount of tax deductibility that's available on interest. And the third fact the member overlooks is actually, if you look at the data from IRD, the New Zealand investors were paying less tax on their property investors than those from overseas.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Stuart Smith.
Speaker, is the Minister aware of any concerns being expressed about the targeting of ethnic Chinese in New Zealand in the debate on housing?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Yes, I am aware of concerns. A number of people have expressed concern to me that assuming people with Chinese-sounding names are immoral foreign speculators was as unfair. I'm also aware that a particular mayoral candidate for Auckland has distanced himself and apologised to the Chinese community for Labor's racial profiling.
Order. Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Supplementary. What is the benefit to New Zealand of negative gearing tax breaks that last year allowed 35% of offshore investors to pay no tax on their rental properties?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Well, the member is firstly incorrect in that with the new tax law, we now require a withholding tax on the sale of any properties. And as I said, actually most of us would accept, particularly in the Auckland market, that the rents actually have not increased substantially and the gains would actually be in the resale. The second point I would make is that the Tax Working Party looked actually at the issue of negative gearing and concluded that there was no gain to the taxpayer of the changes that the member has advocated.
Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
How does allowing offshore speculators to own properties in New Zealand help young Kiwi first home buyers when those speculators are so aggressively using negative gearing tax breaks that they're only paying half as much tax per property as local landlords do.
Mr. Speaker,
The Honourable Dr.
member's
Smith.
claim is incorrect. The numbers for overseas people was 35%. The number actually for New Zealand investors was 43%, i.e. there was a larger portion of New Zealand investors in the property market. And I also point out the fact that actually the level of offshore investment from overseas residents in respect of property is small.
Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
When will he stop backing offshore speculators and instead start backing New Zealand first home buyers by banning offshore speculators and shutting down negative gearing tax breaks for property speculation?
Mr. Speaker,
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
New Zealand tax law treats those that are offshore exactly the same in terms of their tax liabilities in New Zealand, except with the change that we actually made on the 1st of July with requiring a withholding tax. I'd also point out to the member, what has he got against New Zealand citizens that may be working overseas for a period, who own a property in New Zealand and rent that property out, and why should they be taxed any differently to any other investor? Good point.
Order. Question number 5, James